I don't know if I can do this.
Just be honest with them, darling.
But what if it's too late? Sit down, Diep.
Okay, I will.
Yes, listen to Margaret. Sit down, Diep.
Tell me.
I mean, it's been so hard, Margaret. I don't know what to do.
Tell me. It's just so hard.
I know. Just breathe.
I'm trying to figure out how.
Here, just the way you like it. Strong and in your favorite mug. Thank you, Margaret. Here is your tea, just how you like it. Strong in your favorite mug.
Oh, thank you, Margaret. That is so kind of you. You look so tired, honey. Is everything all right? I'm just so exhausted. Thank you for coming.
You look exhausted. What's wrong?
Just a long week. I'm so tired.
Take it easy. We'll figure it out.
He didn't know me for almost 2 hours yesterday.
I know it's hard.
He didn't know me for almost 2 hours yesterday.
I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you love change? Slowly, quietly, and felt completely helpless to stop it? Not because you didn't try, but because some things cannot be stopped. Only witnessed. Margaret has been witnessing it for over a year now. Every month she drives to Diep's house. She refills the bird feeder. She makes tea. She sits with her son in the afternoon and talks about small things. The weather. The garden. Television program he may or may not remember watching. And every month, she drives home alone and sits in her car for a while before going inside. This is her story. And I think if you have ever loved someone through something impossible, you are going to feel every word of it now. Margaret does not talk about it much. That is just who she is. A certain generation of women, and I think many of you watching know exactly what I mean. They were raised to carry things quietly, to keep the household steady, to be the one who holds it together so everyone else can fall apart a little. Margaret is that woman. She has been that woman her whole life. But there is one place she lets it out. Every Sunday morning, Margaret calls her oldest friend, Dorothy. They have known each other for 41 years. They live 3 hours apart now and see each other maybe twice a year, but they talk every Sunday without fail. Dorothy does not offer advice. She just listens. And for Margaret, that is everything. One Sunday in January, Margaret picks up the phone and Dorothy answers on the second ring. "How is he this week?" Dorothy asks. No preamble. She already knows what Margaret needs to talk about. "He had 3 bad days," Margaret says. "Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday." "And the good days?" "Wednesday was lovely. He was completely himself. We sat in the garden after lunch, and he told me a story about when James was 7 and broke the kitchen window with a baseball. He remembered every detail, the sound it made, the look on his father's face. That must have been a good afternoon." It was a pause. That is almost worse. You know, the good days. Dorothy is quiet for a moment, because you know what's coming after. "Because I know what's coming after?" Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. The good days being almost harder than the bad ones. I think anyone who has walked this road with a spouse, a parent, a sibling, knows exactly what. Margaret means the good days give you hope, and hope, when you know the direction things are going, can be the hardest thing of all to hold. That same January, Margaret arrives on a Saturday and finds Diep in the kitchen looking more tired than usual. Not the tired that a good night's sleep fixes, the deep tired, the kind that lives behind your eyes. "Sit down," Margaret says immediately. "Antaltlam, I'll make the tea today." "You don't have to." "Sit down." Diep. Diep sits. Margaret moves around the kitchen the way she has learned to over these months. She knows where the tea is. She knows which mug Diep prefers. She knows to make it strong. She sets the mug down and sits across from her daughter-in-law. "Tell me," she says. Diep wraps her hands around the mug. "He didn't know me for almost 2 hours yesterday," she says quietly. "Well, that's the longest it has been." Margaret nods slowly. "He was very polite about it." Diep continues. "That was the strange part. He was lovely to me, offered me a seat, asked if I wanted anything to drink, like I was a visitor." She pauses. "Like I was a perfectly nice stranger who had wandered into his house. And then he came back." Around dinner time, he walked into the kitchen and said, "You look tired, sweetheart. Did something happen today?" Diep's voice is steady but only just, and I said no, nothing happened. Everything is fine. The kitchen is very quiet. "You didn't tell him," Margaret says. "How do you tell someone that? How do you say, 'This morning you didn't know my name, and it was the loneliest 2 hours of my life'?" She shakes her head. "I couldn't." Margaret reaches across the table and puts her hand over Diep's. She does not say anything for a moment. Then she says, "He knows he is loved. Even when he doesn't know your name, he knows." Diep nods. She does not trust her voice right now. Here's what I learned from Margaret that January. Carrying something quietly is not the same as carrying it alone. Margaret drives 3 hours every month. She makes tea she did not have to make. She sits in a garden talking about broken windows and baseball stories with a son who may not remember the conversation by morning. She does not do this out of obligation. She does it because that is what love looks like when you have run out of ways to fix things. You just show up. You put your hand over someone else's, and you say, "He knows he is loved." Even when the words are small, they are enough. Later that same afternoon, Margaret goes to sit with James. Diep takes Nye to the park. Just an hour, just some air. Margaret and James sit in the living room. The Remember book is on the side table. The bird feeder outside is busy. James is having a good afternoon. Clear and warm and present. They talk about nothing important for a while. Then James says, without looking away from the window, "I worry about her, you know." Diep? She doesn't sleep well. She thinks I don't notice, but I notice. Margaret looks at her son. She is all right," she says carefully. "She is strong." James says, "That is not the same thing." He is quiet for a moment. I used to be the one who took care of things, fixed things. Now I can't even. He stops. Some mornings I wake up and I lie there and I think, what exactly am I still giving her? What is left that I can actually give? Margaret is very still. This is the most he has said about it in months. She takes her time before she answers. You give her a reason to come home, she says finally. Every single day. You are the reason this house feels like a home and not just a place to sleep. She pauses. Home, that is not a small thing. James, that is everything. He looks at her. You have to say that. You're my mother. I am your mother, she agrees, which means I have known you longer than anyone. And I am telling you, what you give that family every day is more than you know. James is quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird lands on the feeder. Then another. She deserves better than this, he says softly. She deserves exactly this. Margaret says firmly, she deserves you, all of you, every version of you. And she knows that. She reaches over and puts her hand on his arm. She chose you. Every day, she keeps choosing you. Does that not tell you something? James looks at his mother, and for a moment, he looks very much like the boy who broke the kitchen window with a baseball and stood in the yard, not knowing what to say. Yeah, he says quietly. I suppose it does. When Diep and I get home an hour later, Margaret is in the kitchen starting dinner. Diep stops in the doorway. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. Margaret keeps chopping. Go sit with him for a bit. He is having a good afternoon. Don't waste it in the kitchen with me. Diep looks at her for a moment. Thank you, she says, for today, for all of it. Margaret waves a hand without turning around. Go. Diep goes, and Margaret stands at the kitchen counter and chops vegetables and lets herself have a few quiet minutes where she does not have to hold her face in any particular way. Just a mother in her son's kitchen, doing the only thing she can still do, showing up. Here is what I want to leave you with today. Margaret is in her 70s. She has buried a husband. She has raised children. She has lived long enough to know that life does not always go the way you planned. But she will tell you, nothing prepared her for this. Watching your child change, watching him ask what he still has to give, watching him worry about the people he loves, even as he is losing himself. Nothing prepares you for that. And yet, she drives 3 hours every month. She makes the tea. She sits in the garden. She puts her hand over someone else's and says, he knows he is loved, because that is all any of us can do. In the end, we cannot stop the hard things. We can only make sure the people inside them know they are not alone. What happened in this episode? Margaret has been carrying this quietly for over a year. Every month she shows up. Every month she drives home alone and sits in her car. Her oldest friend Dorothy is the only one she lets it out with. This January, she arrives to find Diep exhausted after 2 hours of James not recognizing her. Margaret makes the tea, puts her hand over Diep's, says the only thing there is to say. Later, she sits alone with James, and he says something she was not expecting. He asks what he still has left to give. Margaret tells him the truth, and for a moment, he looks like her boy again. Diep comes home. Margaret is in the kitchen making dinner, and she waves her away and says, "Go be with him. Don't waste the good afternoon." The lesson: showing up is its own kind of love. You do not need the right words. You do not need to fix anything. You just need to be there, in the kitchen, at the table, on the end of a phone line every Sunday morning. Margaret cannot stop what is happening to her son, but she can make sure that every single person in that house knows they are not carrying it alone. And sometimes, that is the most powerful thing one person can do for another. Take care of each other, and thank you for watching.